how it works and why it works, and that we are applying control mechanisms at each stage of our adoption, development, and deployment to deal with the license obligations. In practice, what it means is that you got to have supply, development, and deployment processes, and processes for cleaning things up when things go wrong. Lawyers always talk about due diligence, about having proof that you're doing the right thing. And that's what this is about. It's about having processes to allow you to do the right thing. And if something is going wrong, that you or any third party can look at the processes, can see that the mechanisms are in place, and you can quickly identify where the failure was, why it happened, and make sure it doesn't happen again. It's about control. I think this is important because one thing I have encountered several thousand times is that people get so excited by free software that they almost think it's like public domain, that you can copy it off the internet, paste it, put it in a product, and it'll be okay. Of course it isn't. You don't do that with Microsoft's code or Adobe's code. You don't do that with free software either. You have processes to understand what you can do with the code according to what the copyright holder said. And those processes allow you to regulate it. It's obvious, it's normal business practice, but it's worth restating because it's very common that people using free software think it's exempt from normal business practice. It's not. It's exactly the same as any other approach to software. It has a few rules. You manage the rules with processes that can be audited. Where free software is a little bit maybe different is in that you are dealing with tens of thousands of copyright holders. You're dealing with a huge global community of people making the technology, and you have no idea what their priorities are, why they built it, what they really think. The thing with free software is that some people are doing it to make money. Some people are doing it to make technology. Some people are doing it to facilitate completely different political or social goals. So you have to have a strategy of dealing with the fact that they created some of the technology that you're using. That they're the licensees, but they're also, they're the licensors, but they're also the suppliers. They grant you the technology, and they provide the new versions of the technology. You've got a business relationship with them if you engage with free software, and you have to think about how that relationship works and how it's different from how you've operated before. It's not procurement in the normal sense. You can get their technology simply by downloading it. But the new versions are coming from an entity that you might not understand, that might have completely different priorities to you. You're dependent on them, but you're not in a normal contractual relationship with them. It's a little bit different from proprietary software. And this is an area where free software tends to confuse companies the most. They have no idea what their suppliers really want, what they're doing, or why they're doing it. All the companies know is that they're dependent on these suppliers, that they're relying on these people to make the next version of BusyBox, or the Linux kernel, or the Apache web server. But they're not quite sure how their suppliers are operating. Because on one hand, you've got individuals with strong personalities. On the other hand, you've got multinational corporations. On the other hand, you've got intelligence agencies, national governments. There's a lot of different people. In free software, we've engaged with this complexity, with this environment of potential collaboration through communicating, through talking. And that means that we're not doing a negotiation to sign a contract. It means we're discussing what people are doing and why they're doing it. So, free software has projects that develop certain code segments. These projects are in some ways structurally similar to a software development company, except that they don't care if you use it or not. They don't really have a great motive for selling you the code. They're happy for you to use it, but they usually don't care if you do. So what you have to do is approach the relationship thinking that you're seeking value from their code. You have to be honest about your intentions, about why you're going to use their technology, about how you're going to use it, where you're going to use it, and where appropriate, if they're interested, about what you're going to require in the future. In other words, to build up a relationship that you like what they're making, you're going to use it for XYZ purpose, and here's where you're going with it. This relationship allows you to work with them on a development level, but also on a governance level. The fact is that if you are able to communicate with these suppliers effectively, if you're able to say bluntly, let's say, I want to use your free software to put in products that I will sell, and I would really like to see this free software optimized for, let's say, a certain embedded series of architectures. Then they might say something like, it's great you're using it, that's fantastic, follow the license, and if you want to see it optimized on these architectures, well, you can do it yourself, or you can fund us to do it. Build up a rapport. It's not that difficult, it's just different to signing a contract. There are norms, there are normal methods of operating that you see. One of the key norms is fostered around the Linux kernel, where you have a large independent development community hosted in a way fostered by the Linux Foundation, which helps employ independently key developers. So the developer doesn't work for IBM or Intel or HP or any one interest, but rather the developer works in a generic sense to make Linux better for everyone. And it also helps negotiate market requirements. Linux Foundation helps a lot of different organizations in certain areas sit down and create a norm. Example, I think perhaps my favorite example was about Linux being improved for telecommunication use, carrier-grade Linux. Companies like Hewlett-Packard and various other telecommunications implementation experts got together and said, if the Linux kernel was to be put into telecommunications, what do we need to get it certified? And they came up with a list of requirements of changes. And this was a learning experience for them because they basically posted the list of requirements and changes to the Linux kernel developers, who promptly completely ignored them and paid no attention at all. The corporations went away and said, well, we made the list of requirements, and why didn't they pay attention? They realized they hadn't explained to the developers, the worldwide development community, why it was important. They hadn't actually thought about telling the developers that if we get to carrier grade on the Linux kernel, it's really important because X, Y, Z, technical reason, social reason, whatever. So they went back to the community and explained why carrier grade Linux was important in professionalization, in adoption, in the future of development, and very, very quickly it was implemented. These experiences, these norms, are all about how you communicate with third-party creators of code. And you can easily find out by speaking with people like Linux Foundation, or, for instance, speaking with projects like the Apache project, or the Eclipse Foundation for Development. How do they deal with thousands of collaborators, everyone there for a different reason, but everyone building on the same framework? It's not magic. It works like this. You're just honest about what you want. You're direct, you're straight. This is what I want, this is what I will bring back. You stick to facts, not emotion, not politics, not intangibles. That's become increasingly important, especially across cultures. because we find that political norms, social norms, don't maintain globally. People have different perspectives about what is normal, and that has been an interesting shift. Free software is the only truly global method of collaborating on technology. There is no barrier to entry. Anyone, anywhere in the world can use it, and they are. But across the continents, we occasionally bump into problems with communication. Just stick to the facts. When it comes to companies, communication is fascinating as well. Your relationship, as with projects, is a little bit different. You're not usually purchasing anything from your collaborators on something like the Linux kernel. You're just spending money together to build a platform and then trying to hit each other on the head in the market with the same platform. You know, as NEC and HP and IBM invest on the Linux kernel, they are working together. As they are deploying in the market, they're trying to destroy each other. It's a fascinating relationship. Free software is about the collaboration. The relationship of competition and conflict happens outside of the development and governance of free software. So when you're dealing with companies and free software, just like the projects, it's all about communication. You are actually sharing a platform. You're sharing a platform to build products or solutions or whatever you label it today. So what you do is you tell people what your requirements are, what your contribution will be, and you work out where you have common interest. And where you have common interest, you build a relationship. At that point, you might create formal contracts, or you might simply informally collaborate. It's not that difficult to implement. In practice, we have found that most of the competition in terms of differentiation, the point where you want your software to be different, is a very, very small percentage of the total software we deploy globally today. So for the most part, the differentiation is on the brand and the support structure. So the fact is that when you sit down and you talk openly about platform development, you'll find about 98% of what you want to build in infrastructure is identical. So you'll just think, well, heck, let's pool our R&D. Let's work together. That's where free software absolutely excels. And to be part of that, you just need to be relatively open, again, about what you want. It's not a normal contractual relationship. You're going to have 10, 20, 30, 50, 200 companies all talking at the same time about what they really want. You can't keep too many trade secrets about the fact you want another improvement on the Linux virtual machine or whatever. The experience in the West with free software is that the primary benefit is all about collaboration. It's all about working together. The primary benefit of free software is not technical. It's not security. It's not even directly price. Not at all. Our figures all show that the use of any technology with complexity, like software, is expensive. The maintenance and support costs are going to be high, whether it's proprietary software or free software. The benefits in terms of things like security analysis are there, but they are relatively marginal. The figures do not suggest that free software is thousands of times better than proprietary software. It suggests that in security terms, it's a little better. In cost terms, it's pretty much the same. The benefit of free software, the tremendous benefit, is the collaboration. The fact that free software is the only model we have ever seen where so many people can work together with such a low barrier to entry on a technology. So the collaboration is very, very important. And anything that slows down collaboration is losing money. In other words, any barrier we have, whether it's a formal barrier due to policy, or whether it's an informal barrier simply due to a lack of policy, anything that prevents people working together is reducing efficiency and costing money. So it boils down to the idea that we need to communicate. We need to communicate a lot more about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we can do it together. So, back into licensing. Like I said, licenses are all about how you can work together. The fact is that law is simply a formal method of speaking to allow people who do not know or trust each other to work together. That's all it is. Law is a formal mechanism to allow transactions. Free software transactions are governed by law, and therefore, when we want to think about collaboration, we want to think about transactions in free software, it's all about the licensing. But the perspective we're going to kind of look at today is not based on the idea that we must follow the licenses because the licenses are there. Rather, it's based on the idea that free software has this tremendous value, this incredible ability to allow us to collaborate, to reduce costs, and increase productivity. It has this value because most software technology development and products is going to be based on shared platforms. We're going to be doing the same work again and again. We can be really stupid and do the work on our own and waste time and money, or we can be really smart and do the work together and save time and money. So our big question with free software, our really big question, is what do we need to do to allow the collaboration, to allow the transactions in free software to be as quick and as easy as possible, while making sure that the transactions, the trust created by a formal method of interacting is not broken. See, the interesting thing here is that the value of free software is that people can use it. And they can use it because they know how it will be used. If people don't follow the rules, if people don't follow the transaction rules, people are going to share less. And the value of free software will decline. The potential will not be maximized. A simple problem statement, a business statement, it's not about law, and it's certainly not about software code. That's irrelevant. What we're talking about are the mechanisms to allow us to operate together. So, there are expectations in free software. These are the expectations that people are going to follow the licenses, people are going to collaborate, and people will recognize that there is value here. These are the basic assumptions that underpin the artificial trust model of free software. Basically, if you're dealing with anyone using free software, you expect them to think this too. If someone doesn't think this, then there may be an issue. Let me explain briefly. If people don't follow the licenses on a very simple level, they're taking someone else's creation and using it in a way that the creator said, don't. That's a very fundamental breach of trust. But there are other breaches. Collaboration is an important one. If people create free software and invest in it because the collaboration has value, then people who do not collaborate, who do not work together, but want to use the benefit of free software, well, they're not regarded in such a positive light. It's nothing personal, but it's about the fact that people are investing because the collaboration creates value. Not collaborating is reducing value. It's that simple. And that last point, recognizing the value. I showed you a couple of figures from UNU Merit about adoption and the GDP value of free software in the European Union area. And I mentioned that part of their research indicated that the Linux kernel is worth over 800 million euro. It's important that if people engage with free software, they also understand that the technology is valuable. Because we collaborate and share development, And because we have licenses that allow us to take the product without paying cash for it, sometimes people think that means that it doesn't actually have monetary value. But of course, that's not true. Creating this code is hugely expensive. It consumes a huge amount of resources. So if people don't recognize that it has value, it's got an issue with collaboration. If people aren't investing in it, using resources to create this value, then they are sometimes regarded as a problem in free software's developmental and governance community. Let me go into some details here about what this means in practice. And I think it's time to pull down into the real world, into what this means in the real world. I spoke about the theory and the approach. But the real question in a market economy like the Taiwanese one is probably, how do we use it? How do we optimize it in practice? And the biggest question we get nowadays is about supply chains, managing the supply chain, because very few people make anything. Okay, the thing is that free software, as I said, has risk. And that means that one of the first questions you get when you're using free software is, what do we do with all of this potential risk? Let's say licensing, obligations on the licenses. We've got thousands of other people's code in our product. And, this supplier is supplying some of it, this supplier is supplying some of it, I'm selling it. Who gets the risk if someone's code license isn't followed correctly? When we're looking at thousands of people's code, we're looking at maybe dozens of licenses. Who gets the potential risk? And the answer is that you have a negotiation to allocate the risk involved in using free software. One of your handouts today is a rather cool document. It's this very tightly packed spreadsheet thing. This is a product of the European Legal Network. Our crazy lawyers thought that managing free software was basically a risk issue for them. And they created the risk grid as a document that talks about, in a free software procurement situation, who gets what risk and why, and what does that mean? So this risk grid is all about that little idea of understanding what risk comes with what licenses. Does it go to the supplier or the purchaser? How does it go to them? And what does that mean? Something like the risk grid is critical in managing the supply chain because it provides a lot of baseline decision-making mechanisms. It contains the knowledge of dozens of lawyers in the corporate sphere who've been using this technology for a long time, and explains how they've found in practice it works in the supply chain. When it comes to basically maximizing value of free software, when dealing with the supply chain, we found that risk was the main stumbling block, that fear or cost was causing people to be hesitant in using more free software, or was causing them to put a lot of terms onto their suppliers that didn't really help collaboration. So something like the risk grid, allocating risk fairly, accepting that part of your cost in using free software is having some risk, and accepting that sometimes some of the risk has to go right back to your suppliers. Working that out was critical to managing the supply chain in our view. You'll find it in that document. Have a look. Remembering that distribution is key is another thing. Free software licenses, by and large, it's all about the moment you distribute the code. That's the critical point. If your supplier gives you code, they have distributed it. If it contains free software, they must distribute it according to the license. Can't even count the amount of times that we've had a compliance issue. We've chased it back down the supply chain, and we find a company that says, oh, my supplier gave it to me, but now they're refusing to give me, let's say, the source code. And always the answer is, Yeah, so they have to. Distribution is key on free software. Distribution is key. The licenses affect copying. They're copyright licenses. They are not contracts. When you're dealing with risk, when you're dealing with making products, when you're dealing with the supply chain, you always have to think that every time we distribute between any legal entity, that's the moment the licenses count. That's where we have to put a lot of our process and policy focus to make sure that we're going to be okay. You don't really have to worry too much about what's going on inside your company. What you have to worry about is when you're going to send something outside, what licenses are on the code, and what does that mean in terms of our obligations? Basically, you need to be able to record and audit code. You need to know where that code came from. You need to know what licenses applied to that code and be ready to show that to any third party that claims otherwise. Due diligence. Nothing magical. It's a bit like procurement. These are the key steps in procurement. I mean, beyond allocating risk, we have to talk about how you do the transaction in the first place. You identify where stuff came from. You identify which supplier and what they stated about it. You identify what your engineers put in a product and what license applies to it. You keep a record. And you're ready with that report history in case something goes wrong. And as soon as something happens, you audit. You audit and you look back into your books and you are able to say that this code is under this license according to this evidence that we have, and we fulfilled it this way. Again, that's a very elementary process. It's a very simple process. It's just one that occasionally goes wrong, that people do not audit where code comes from, that their engineers do not record what they're using, and then something goes to market and something goes horribly wrong. Procurement works in that way, and no matter what step you are in the supply chain, by doing that, by keeping those records, you manage to contain risk, to obey the licenses much more effectively, and to make sure that your utilization of free software is as problem-free as possible. An important point, I think, because if you do something like that and you're talking to a purchaser, if you're able to say, I know where this came from, I know everything that's in this product, and you can have a quick audit if you want, well, then you will be given less penalties and less risk in the transaction, of course. If you turn up and say, this is our own magic creation, or our development team said this is fine, if you're in any way vague about the origins of the code and the potential for third-party code, third-party licenses, and third-party obligations, then it's going to be difficult in the supply chain. Then things like the risk grid will suggest that you get a lot more penalties and risk. So with these basic steps, we have found that in practice, procurement in free software works very effectively. That this circumvents maybe 80 or 90% of all the market issues with licensing we have seen in free software. Of course, that's an interesting thing, because outside of distribution itself, many companies have internal development. And internal development, like I said, you don't worry too much about it, right? You want your engineers to go create stuff to make great products. You don't want to be basically having them speak to legal every day, all day. So what we found is that you can have inside a company, you can have a way to deal with the code that allows your engineers to work freely, to do more collaboration while reducing your risk. Those are two contradictory approaches, because normally the more people are allowed freedom, the greater the risk that something bad will happen. But what you do is basically you have a list of stuff that is definitely not okay for you. Stuff that definitely does not work, because you know that if that gets into an end product, you're going to be in trouble somewhere. You're not ready to deal with it yet. You have a list of stuff that is okay to use, that you're confident that your supply teams, your support teams, your issue resolution teams can deal with it. And then basically when anything unknown crops up, you get that referred to legal. Let me kind of show you this. This is from Royal Philips Electronics. They were very kind to share this data. Royal Philips Electronics are a European company. They make all types of weird stuff, from razors to televisions. And nowadays, they're putting a lot of Linux kernel-based solutions into it. They mainly use very tight embedded Linux, so it's Linux kernel, BusyBox, small components. Anyway, they make a lot of products. They make products quickly. And Philips has huge cost, because Philips is a very established European company. So they have an awful lot of cost centers based on high wages, pension plans, obligations. In other words, it's very difficult to compete directly on price with, say, Chinese or Taiwanese companies. So Philips looked at free software as a great method of building technology quickly and efficiently. Though one of the important points, going right back to collaboration, is that their engineers can only maximize value on free software, just like anyone else, if they can work on it relatively freely, if they can work on it in a relatively open, collaborative way. How do you manage that when you have a structure that doesn't allow you to put risk on your company's balance sheet and a requirement to compete on technology by allowing collaboration? Well, this is how. This is hard to read from there, but it basically says, will the product have free software? If yes, is it on our approved list? If it's on the approved list, then basically it's a license that Philips is totally comfortable with. The engineer goes, yep, there it is, it's this license. And that's it. He doesn't have to check with his manager or the legal department. He just, yep, it's this license. And on it goes. If it's a license that's not allowed, the engineer simply doesn't get to use it. If it's a license that's unknown, well, then the engineer contacts the legal department. This simple process allows the engineers to have a list of licenses and, let's say, projects that they can just use anything out of. They can quickly adopt it, they can utilize it, they can make tests, they can build a product. In other words, a very simple workflow, pulling back, knowing what's okay, what's not okay, and how to deal with unknowns, allowed them to deal with code internally very effectively. And in combination with having good record management and allocating risk with their suppliers, it allows them to do adoption of base technologies and to build on top of the technologies with new stuff, while being pretty flexible in allowing the engineers to go crazy with experimenting. Very important, very simple process management. These process management techniques circumvent a great percentage of the licensing issues that people encounter. Like I said, what we have to do is read the licenses and follow the terms. And that basically means on a company-by-company basis, we read some licenses, we like them, we make a note of the terms, and then we're comfortable with it. We're comfortable with it, and by using something like this, our engineers don't have to think about it. All they have to do is identify, oh, it's this license, I tick the box on this license, and off we go. You can go right back to that engineer and say, you know, Bob, I need the code you were working on, we're going to release the product, I need source code, and I need your change log. It's that simple. You don't lose it. You don't get the, uh-oh, what's that, where is it, moment. And that's important. It's very simple. It's very important. Yeah. The thing is, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. As I said, even if you have processes for supply, and you have processes for development and processes for deployment, sometimes You're going to release a product, and you think it's got all of this stuff, and you've followed all the licenses. You're providing source code. You've printed the licenses in manuals or put them in menus of the product, whatever. And then someone like Harold Velte comes along and says, actually, there's a problem. And this is an interesting point. This is an interesting point because at this moment, at that second, is probably where most companies using free software tend to get into the most trouble. And this is fascinating. This is fascinating because even companies that are very, very good at understanding the license terms, even companies with all of these processes for basically auditing the terms, auditing their development, auditing their compliance. When something goes wrong, at that stage, when someone says, actually, you just broke a license on valuable third-party code, at that point, many companies make a terrible mistake, and they act as if they're dealing with proprietary software. I think that after the simple advice of read the license and follow the license, my next bit of advice is remember that this is not proprietary software. That when something goes wrong, and it will go wrong sometime because software is complex, people are making products quickly, it's very hard to be right all the time. When something does go wrong, you have to think that this is a collaborative model, a very valuable collaborative model, and you have to solve the problem in that context. And that's I think, where we need to talk about moving beyond pure licensing terms and dealing with the fact that free software is a different approach to software. What I'm talking about is that you have thousands of copyright holders. And these copyright holders all have the valid right to sue you if you are breaking the license. So what you need to do is you need to be able to not just show that you're trying to follow the license, but to be sincere about it. Because, for instance, if Harold contacts you, he's talking about his copyright, and he's not talking about the whole Linux kernel, he's talking about his copyright. If you burn your bridges, if you make a mistake with someone like Harold, you not only will get litigated against by Harold, but potentially by every other copyright holder on the Linux kernel, if they so feel like it. What you got to do is you have to be sincere about the fact that you know that this is third-party code. You know this is about collaboration. You know the licenses are important. And you're trying to follow them. You know, you've got these processes in place for adopting the software, for allocating risk, for having internal use, for deploying. You do your best to audit it. And when it's going wrong, you communicate effectively with the reporter about how you're going to analyze the problem and resolve it. The steps that in gplviolations.org have been most important, and most people have made interesting mistakes around, is accepting reports of issues. There was one memorable occasion when I was trying to contact a major telecommunications giant because journalists had got information about a license infringement. And I remember spending an hour or so calling different people in the telecommunications company saying, well, Free Software Foundation Europe and gplviolations.org are being contacted by journalists, and we're asked, what are we going to be doing about your license infringement? And, you know, it's like, well, quite frankly, it was sort of news to us, but we're looking into it now. And the important thing is that we deal with this communication issue and we work out what is wrong, if anything. And at that time, the telecommunications giant was pretty new to this field, and they didn't actually have any way to accept a report of issues. Eventually, I got through to their trademark lawyer, and the trademark lawyer said, the copyright guys aren't here right now, but you know what? They're good lawyers. I'm sure it's fine. Didn't really go down that way in the media. It looked horrible. So yeah, have a way to accept a report of issues. Do something like have an email address where people can report a suspected issue to you. It's that simple. And have someone read it. Have someone read it. And investigate the issue. provide feedback. You know, get the email reporting an issue and just tell people, hey, we're looking into it. We're having a look. Google is a good example of that. I mean, on the gplviolations.org list, Google is there. Chris DeBona is often emailing out. People report an Android issue. And, you know, Chris might be like, well, it's not our product, but I forwarded it to XYZ company. Or it could be like, okay, Google is investigating this. Feedback. Resolve the issue. Go fix the problem. Go fix the problem according to the license terms and tell the reporter that you fixed the problem. You know, communicate with them. Because it's, as I said, it's not a normal relationship. You're in a collaborative environment with thousands of people holding copyright. And the important thing is that you do not break the trust in the transaction. In other words, they have to know you're taking the license terms seriously. They have to know that you understand that the licenses are valid, that the code is valuable, and that you have sincerely put processes in place to deal with this. It doesn't mean, and I want to pull right back to where I said you need to keep on facts. You know, you don't want to get involved in a discussion about social matters or politics. You don't want to get caught in a discussion where people say that they believe that not only must you follow the license, but you need to do X, Y, Z because of X, Y, Z. Stick to the facts. Stick to the facts. Stick to the license terms. But be very, very, very open about how you understand those terms, how you understand this code is worth so much money, and how you're working to fix it. Let them know what you're doing. I have to say that big kudos to many companies in Europe and America and Taiwan. More and more people are getting very, very good at this, at communicating problem resolution. And this is making the likelihood of litigation, of lawsuits, much less. It's becoming much easier for people to collaborate because more people are being, I suppose, open to communicating their understanding. And that openness also makes mistakes much more understandable. If you show that you're not being sneaky, you're not stealing code, something went wrong, here's what went wrong, here's how we're fixing it, that really helps people trust each other. That helps people work together. That helps the collaboration. That is exactly what everyone, whether they're a business or a nonprofit organization or anything else, that's what they're looking for. Now, there's a nice gentleman with a little sign up there yelling 5 minutes at me. So I'm going to summarize. First of all, free software is not about software. It's simply not. I mean, software is a tool. It's a hammer. It's a really complex hammer, but it's not particularly important. Free software has no value. Its application has value. Software as a good is just mathematics that allows electrons to move around in a way that can be useful. Free software is a policy control approach that discusses and explains how we can use software in a way that lets us share the ability for multiple people to think about math better than one person. And basically, what we have to do when we look at free software is think that the value proposition that we found in software is that in a complex method, when it's built up into complex structures, it provides useful tools for communicating and solving problems. We need to think that complexity is difficult and introduces errors, and it costs a lot in terms of resources. And collaboration around complexity allows us to build even more complex structures with greater accuracy. Free software is a formal method of describing how that collaboration around complexity can work and what the rules are to allow people who do not know each other and do not trust each other to do that collaboration. So, free software has no value per se, but the implementation of free software in facilitating communication, facilitating the development of more complex technologies that allow better communication and problem solving, that implementation is almost incalculable in value. It has immense value. You need to maximize your value in free software by understanding this, that by approaching software in a certain way with a certain perspective, you can get more from software. If you understand that, if you understand it on a business sense, then you can maximize value. Remember that the fact is that you don't know the people who you're working with. And these people, more often than not, have different motives to you. So therefore, you need a formal mechanism, in this case licensing, to allow you to maximize value, to allow you to get the collaboration necessary to obtain the best benefit possible from software technology. The licenses are not a burden. The licenses are a way of describing a relationship that we can all rely on. That's what the licenses are there for, and that's how we need to think about them. The licenses are all about working together, certainty in collaboration. When it comes to licensing compliance as business intelligence, what we're thinking about, what we're working with, is the proposition that collaboration is essential for the future of software. Software is essential for the future of technology. Basically, free software and its approach to collaboration is something we all need to do. We need to follow the licenses so we can work together. If we don't do that, we're going to reduce the effectiveness of future technological development as a whole. It's that simple. Every party who doesn't communicate properly is missing an opportunity. Licensing compliance, reading the licenses and using them, is not about just following other people's rules. It's about thinking how you can maximize your company's investment in technology, how you can get the best possible return. And you do it, in essence, in the exact same way you have always done everything. You have processes that simply allow you to regulate according to the rules and to audit when things go wrong. Thankfully, in this collaborative model, you can get help from so many people to do this. Every company, every government, and every non-governmental organization using free software wants to collaborate with you, wants to work with you. Things like the European Legal Network show that we can communicate an incredible amount of information and make products like the Risk Grid, and ultimately make products like these newly translated documents from OSSF. Brilliant work. Working with the community and the useful tips for releasing, and I see they use the term open source code with commercial products. All of these documents are appearing because people are working together to explain how we can collaborate more effectively. You can get help in a way you could never get it before because everyone knows that working with you is going to be valuable for them. I'm available for questions in a few minutes, and I'll be very glad to answer anything you've got, but this guy is sidling over to me down the stage and is going to drag me off. So, thank you very much. Basically, FSFE is here to help